Imagine a late night in Washington where the Capitol lights are still on, phones won't stop buzzing, and a quiet panic is spreading through the Republican Party, because this time the crisis isn't coming from Democrats, the media, or a bad election night. It's coming from their own president. And what started as something that sounded almost laughable, Greenland, has now turned into a political time bomb. An obsession so reckless that it's threatening to tear the party apart from the inside, leaving allies confused, lawmakers furious, and the Speaker of the House unable to keep control. And the most dangerous part is this. Everyone in the room knows that if this obsession goes unchecked, it won't just cost elections, it could end a presidency and permanently change America's place in the world. So stay with me, because once you see what's really happening behind the scenes, you'll understand why this story doesn't slow down. It only gets more explosive from here. The camera opens not with a speech or a rally, but with silence. The kind of silence that hangs heavy in Washington right before something breaks. Late night lights glowing inside the Capitol, staffers whispering in hallways, phones vibrating nonstop, and somewhere deep inside the Republican Party, a realization slowly setting in that this time the chaos isn't coming from Democrats, the media, or the deep state, but from within their own house, because this time the threat isn't an election loss or a bad poll, it's their own president dragging them toward a geopolitical cliff over a frozen land. He cannot stop talking about Greenland, and in those first 10 seconds, you need to understand one thing clearly. This is not a story about foreign policy. This is a story about power, ego, fear, and a political movement eating itself alive. It starts like so many Trump-era disasters do, with something that sounds absurd enough to laugh off. Cutting checks to Greenland, buying territory, ownership, as if the world were a monopoly board. But behind the absurdity, Republicans in the House are staring at spreadsheets, district maps, and internal polling that all scream the same warning, that Donald Trump has put them in the worst political position they've seen in the modern era, and he doesn't seem to care. Because while they are trying to survive the next election cycle, he is chasing something much older and darker, the instinct to conquer, to brand, to expand his name across a map that he barely understands but deeply desires. Behind closed doors, lawmakers who once defended every tweet and every tantrum are no longer laughing, because they know something the base doesn't want to hear. Invading or coercing an ally like Greenland would not be a stunt. It would be a rupture, the kind that ends presidencies and shatters alliances. And for the first time in years, the word impeachment is being whispered again, not by Democrats, but by Republicans. And that is where this story truly begins. To understand why Greenland has become the spark for a MAGA civil war, you have to understand the psychology driving it, because the policy case collapses under even the lightest scrutiny, and everyone in Washington knows it, even those pretending otherwise on cable news. Greenland is already an ally, already tied into NATO, already hosting U.S. military infrastructure, including a base that has been part of American missile defense strategy for decades, a base that Vice President J.D. Vance himself visited, meaning there is no universe in which the administration can credibly claim ignorance or necessity here. There is no urgent national security gap to fill, no hostile power poised to seize Greenland tomorrow, no strategic vacuum that requires American ownership instead of cooperation. What exists instead is obsession, and Trump himself all but admitted it when he told the New York Times that ownership matters, that possession gives you something treaties cannot, that leases and agreements are inferior to outright control. And in that moment, anyone who has ever watched him operate recognized the pattern instantly. Because this isn't about defense, it's about dominance. The same instinct that drove him to put his name in gold letters on buildings he didn't even fully own. The same fixation on size, visibility, and permanence. Greenland looks enormous on a Mercator-projected map, dwarfing continents, commanding the top of the world. And while geographers can explain for hours why that projection distorts reality, Trump doesn't live in that world. He lives in a visual, instinctive, gut-driven universe where big equals powerful and ownership equals legacy. And the tragedy is that this instinct, which might be merely ridiculous in real estate, becomes catastrophic when translated into global politics. Inside the House of Representatives, that catastrophe is no longer theoretical. Republicans are furious, not just because the idea itself is reckless, but because of the timing, the optics, and the cost. Trump ran on affordability, on lowering prices, on fighting for forgotten Americans, and now instead of focusing on inflation, housing, or healthcare, he's floating the idea of spending astronomical sums. Figures that, when broken down, amount to hundreds of thousands or even millions per Greenlander, to acquire territory that delivers no immediate benefit to the voters who are already struggling. For swing district Republicans, this is political poison because they know exactly how it will be framed in campaign ads. While your rent went up, while your grocery bill exploded, while your healthcare costs soared, Donald Trump wanted to buy Greenland. And here's the part that terrifies them most. There is no clean way to defend it, no simple talking point, no emotional appeal that lands with suburban voters who decide elections. You can't wrap this in the flag or sell it as toughness when the target is an ally, and you certainly can't explain why it matters more than the issues people feel every day. That fear has turned into something more dangerous for Trump than Democratic outrage, Republican defiance. Don Bacon, a Republican congressman from Nebraska, is not a bomb thrower or a social media provocateur. He's a former Air Force general, a national security conservative, someone whose warnings carry weight precisely because he doesn't issue them lightly. When Bacon publicly called Trump's Greenland fixation utter buffoonery and warned that following through on it could spark bipartisan impeachment efforts, it sent a shockwave through Capitol Hill, because this wasn't anonymous sourcing or a leaked quote. It was a sitting Republican saying out loud what many others were only whispering. Bacon went further, saying that invading an ally would be catastrophic, that it would be the end of Trump's presidency, and that Republicans would not tolerate it. And those words matter because they signal a fracture that Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, is increasingly powerless to control. Mike Johnson's problem is simple and brutal. He doesn't actually command the House anymore. The majority is razor thin, the caucus is divided, and procedural tools that once allowed leadership to bury uncomfortable votes are failing. Discharge petitions are forcing legislation onto the floor that Johnson never wanted to see daylight, and every one of those votes puts Republicans on record in ways that can't be spun away later. This is why Johnson fears individual votes more than massive omnibus bills, because when everything is bundled together, members can hide behind complexity, claiming ignorance or necessity. But when a single issue stands alone, healthcare subsidies, war powers, foreign policy restrictions, there is nowhere to hide. Every yes or no becomes a campaign weapon, and Democrats know it, which is why they are happy to let Republicans tear themselves apart in public. The Greenland issue amplifies this dysfunction because it intersects with something even more volatile: war powers. When Republicans in the Senate, of all places, start voting to restrict a Republican president's ability to unilaterally use military force, you know the situation has crossed a line. These are lawmakers who have spent decades expanding executive power, defending intervention, and warning against weakness. Yet now they are signaling that Trump's instincts cannot be trusted, that his impulsiveness poses a real risk of dragging the country into a conflict with an ally for no coherent reason. That is an extraordinary rebuke, and it raises a question that cuts to the core of this entire saga. If members of the president's own party believe he must be restrained to prevent disaster, what does that say about the state of leadership in the United States? The answer, increasingly, is that leadership has fractured into something closer to survival instinct. Lawmakers are no longer thinking in terms of long-term strategy or ideological purity. They are thinking about the next headline, the next vote, the next primary challenge, and the next general election. Don Bacon is retiring, which gives him a freedom most of his colleagues do not have. And that freedom makes him dangerous to party leadership because he has nothing left to lose. When someone like Bacon hints that he could caucus with Democrats to enable an impeachment if Trump crossed a certain line, it's not because he wants to switch parties, but because he understands leverage. In a House this divided, one or two defections can change everything, and the mere possibility of that defection is enough to destabilize the entire structure. All of this is happening against the backdrop of Trump's broader foreign policy, which has already alarmed allies and emboldened adversaries. His approach to Ukraine, his willingness to echo Russian talking points, and his transactional view of alliances have convinced many Republicans that the traditional post-World War II order is under threat not from external enemies, but from the Oval Office itself. Greenland becomes a symbol in this context, not because of its intrinsic value, but because of what it represents. A president who sees the world not as a network of relationships to manage, but as a collection of assets to acquire, brand, and control. That worldview may thrill a segment of the base that equates aggression with strength, but it terrifies policymakers who understand how fragile global stability actually is. And here's where the story turns darker, because once impeachment enters the conversation, even hypothetically, it changes incentives. Every misstep becomes magnified, every reckless statement becomes potential evidence, and every internal disagreement becomes a crack that opponents can widen. Trump famously does not respond well to being told no, and the more resistance he encounters, the more he tends to double down, framing opposition as betrayal. That dynamic all but guarantees escalation, not de-escalation, because backing off would require acknowledging limits, and acknowledging limits has never been his strength. Republicans who hope he will quietly abandon the Greenland idea may be underestimating how deeply it has become tied to his sense of authority and image. This is why part one of this story matters so much, because it captures the moment when farce begins to harden into crisis, when jokes about maps and projections give way to serious discussions about war, impeachment, and the collapse of party discipline. The MAGA movement was built on loyalty to a person, not an institution, and that loyalty is now being tested by the consequences of that person's choices. For years, Republicans justified chaos as the price of winning, but now the bill is coming due. And it is arriving in the form of a frozen island at the top of the world, a speaker who cannot control his chamber, and a president whose instincts may finally be too much even for his own party to tolerate. As we move into the next part of this story, the question is no longer whether this obsession will cause damage, but how much damage it will cause, and whether the people who enabled it are prepared to stop it before it consumes everything in its path. The tension doesn't ease after the first cracks appear. It thickens. Because once a party realizes its leader is no longer controllable, every interaction becomes a calculation, every silence a signal, and every public defense a performance layered over private panic. And that's exactly where Washington finds itself as Greenland morphs from an embarrassing distraction into a full-blown stress test of the Republican Party's remaining coherence. Behind closed doors, the conversations are no longer about whether Trump is serious, because by now everyone understands that seriousness isn't the point. The point is impulse, the way he latches onto an idea and refuses to let go, feeding on resistance as proof of relevance. And for lawmakers already exhausted by years of crisis management, this feels different, heavier, because it drags them into territory they cannot spin their way out of. The House floor becomes a battlefield of procedure rather than ideology, where leadership scrambles to cancel votes it cannot win, where members openly admit they don't know their own numbers, and where the speaker's gavel feels increasingly symbolic rather than authoritative. Because power in this moment doesn't flow from titles, it flows from leverage. And leverage belongs to anyone willing to defy the system without fear of consequences. This is why figures like Don Bacon suddenly loom so large, not because they command massive followings, but because they represent a category of Republican that Trumpism never fully accounted for, the institutional conservative who values alliances, hierarchy, and predictability, and who sees Trump's fixation on Greenland not as boldness, but as recklessness masquerading as strength. What makes this moment so volatile is that it collides with a deeper truth many Republicans have spent years denying, which is that Trump's worldview doesn't distinguish between domestic politics and foreign policy. Everything is transactional, personal, and reactive. And when that mindset meets the machinery of the state, the results are unpredictable at best and disastrous at worst. The Greenland episode exposes this collision in stark terms, because there is no constituency clamoring for it, no expert community endorsing it, and no clear objective beyond the satisfaction of ownership itself. Yet the president continues to float it publicly, forcing allies to respond, markets to speculate, and adversaries to watch closely. NATO partners already uneasy read these signals not as isolated comments, but as indicators of instability, wondering whether the United States still understands the basic premise of alliance, that cooperation is not weakness, and that security is collective rather than proprietary. Inside the Pentagon and the State Department, professionals trained to think in decades rather than headlines are left to quietly plan for contingencies they never expected to consider. Because when a president talks about invading or coercing an ally, even hypothetically, it changes threat assessments, escalation ladders, and diplomatic postures in ways that cannot be undone with a walkback or a tweet. Meanwhile, the political cost continues to compound, because every day Trump spends talking about Greenland is a day he is not talking about affordability, wages, healthcare, or housing, and Republicans in vulnerable districts feel that absence acutely. They know their voters are not ideological purists. They are pragmatic, anxious, and increasingly skeptical of spectacle, and they can sense when leadership has lost the plot. This is why the Greenland story resonates beyond Washington, not because voters have strong opinions about Arctic geopolitics, but because it reinforces a narrative of distraction and detachment, the sense that the president is playing a different game than the one ordinary people are forced to live in. Campaign consultants see it, pollsters measure it, and strategists whisper about it because they understand that elections are rarely lost on ideology alone. They are lost on trust. and trust erodes when leadership appears unserious about the problems that matter most. As this erosion accelerates, the House becomes a theater of exposure, where individual votes force clarity that leadership would rather avoid. The extension of ACA subsidies, the debates over war powers, and the procedural maneuvers that drag bills into the open all serve the same function. They strip away ambiguity and reveal where members actually stand. This terrifies leadership precisely because it removes plausible deniability, the ability to say one thing to donors and another to voters, and it creates a paper trail that opponents can weaponize for years. The irony is that this transparency is not being driven by reformers or idealists, but by dysfunction itself, by a system so fractured that it can no longer hide its internal contradictions. Mike Johnson, caught between a president who demands loyalty and a caucus that fears annihilation, finds himself presiding over a chamber that no longer responds to his cues, a speaker in name, but not in practice. And then there is the Senate, a body often criticized for inertia, suddenly acting as a brake, with Republicans voting to restrict the president's military authority, an almost unthinkable development in another era. These votes are not about Greenland alone. They are about precedent, about drawing a line before impulse becomes action, and about signaling to the world that not everyone in American government is comfortable with where this is heading. For Trump, these votes are an affront, a challenge to his self-image as an unbound decision maker, and they feed into a familiar pattern of grievance and escalation. For Republicans who support them, they are a desperate attempt to reclaim some measure of institutional control before events outrun intentions. The impeachment question hovers over all of this like a storm cloud, not because it is imminent, but because its mere presence reshapes behavior. Lawmakers who would once have dismissed the idea now find themselves gaming out scenarios, asking what happens if Trump crosses a line that even his defenders cannot rationalize, and whether they are prepared to act if that moment comes. The House, unlike the Senate, is more responsive to immediate political pressure, more sensitive to shifts in public mood, and more vulnerable to internal revolt, which makes it the most likely arena for dramatic action. The fact that Republicans are openly discussing impeachment over a hypothetical invasion of an ally underscores how far the conversation has moved from abstract concern to concrete contingency planning. What makes this phase of the story so unsettling is that it unfolds in slow motion, with no clear inflection point, just a steady accumulation of warning signs that many fear will be ignored until it is too late. Trump continues to test boundaries. Republicans continue to flinch and adjust, and the machinery of government continues to grind forward, even as faith in its leadership erodes. The Greenland obsession becomes a proxy for something larger, a symbol of a presidency increasingly untethered from reality, and a party struggling to decide whether loyalty is still worth the cost. As the stakes rise, the space for compromise shrinks, because backing down would require admitting error, and admitting error would puncture the myth of infallibility that has sustained this movement for so long. By the end of this chapter, one thing is clear. The MAGA Civil War is no longer hypothetical, no longer confined to whispers and leaks. It is visible, vocal, and destabilizing, playing out in votes, statements, and strategic defections that hint at a breaking point still to come. The question is not whether the situation is dangerous, but whether anyone with the power to stop it is willing to do so, or whether fear, ambition, and inertia will carry the system forward until a line is crossed that cannot be uncrossed. And as we move into the next part of the story, the focus shifts from warning signs to consequences, from internal revolt to external fallout, because the world is watching, allies are recalibrating, and the cost of this obsession may soon be measured not just in political careers, but in the credibility and stability of the United States itself. By the time the third act of this unfolding drama begins, the question in Washington is no longer whether Donald Trump's fixation on Greenland is dangerous, but whether the system built to restrain presidential power still functions when the threat comes not from ambition cloaked in ideology, but from impulse masquerading as instinct, because something subtle yet profound has shifted beneath the noise. The people tasked with translating presidential intent into action, lawmakers, diplomats, military planners, are no longer assuming rational endgames, and that loss of assumption is one of the most destabilizing forces in politics. Inside the halls of Congress, conversations turn darker, more explicit, as members begin to ask what they would actually do if rhetoric became orders, if posturing turned into mobilization, and if a moment of performative bravado crossed into irreversible escalation, because once that line is crossed, no speech, no spin, no apology can rewind the tape. This is where Greenland stops being a punchline and starts functioning as a stress fracture, revealing how thin the guardrails have become and how much of the system relies not on law alone, but on norms, restraint, and the expectation that leaders understand consequences even when they ignore advice. What unnerves Republicans most in this phase is not Trump's stubbornness, which they have learned to live with, but his growing indifference to internal dissent, the way warnings from his own party seem to register not as caution, but as provocation. The more figures like Don Bacon speak out, the more Trump frames them as weak, disloyal, or irrelevant, reinforcing a feedback loop where compromise is interpreted as surrender and restraint as cowardice. This dynamic leaves institutional Republicans trapped in a paradox. Speaking up risks retaliation and isolation, while staying silent risks complicity in a course they privately believe could end in disaster. For years, many of them convinced themselves that Trump's excesses were rhetorical, that bluster would never translate into action. But the Greenland episode disrupts that comforting narrative because it is so unmoored from strategic logic that it forces a reckoning with motive itself. When there is no clear policy rationale, no coherent objective, only desire, ego, and symbolism, it becomes impossible to predict behavior, and unpredictability at the top of the world's most powerful military is not a quirk, it is a threat. The implications ripple outward, touching institutions that rarely speak publicly, but are acutely sensitive to shifts in tone and intent. Military leadership bound by civilian control, yet responsible for executing orders, begins quietly revisiting assumptions about alliance interoperability and rules of engagement, because even hypothetical conflict with an ally introduces scenarios that planners are trained to avoid, not entertain. Diplomats find themselves issuing reassurances they cannot fully substantiate, trying to convince partners that rhetoric does not equal policy, while privately worrying about how long that distinction can hold. Allies, for their part, listen politely and prepare independently, because history has taught them that political volatility in Washington often precedes sudden unilateral decisions that leave little time for response. In this way, Trump's obsession erodes trust not through action, but through anticipation, as the mere possibility of erratic behavior forces others to hedge, diversify, and distance themselves. Back on Capitol Hill, the procedural chaos intensifies, revealing just how brittle leadership has become. Votes are delayed, pulled, rescheduled, only to be yanked again when counts come up short, and every cancellation becomes its own story, a visible sign that control has slipped. Members openly admit they don't know where their colleagues stand, and that uncertainty breeds paranoia as factions form not around ideology, but around survival strategy. Some Republicans cling tighter to Trump, believing that proximity to power is still their best defense, while others quietly explore escape routes, distancing themselves rhetorically, signaling moderation, or positioning themselves as checks rather than cheerleaders. This fragmentation turns the House into a marketplace of leverage, where a handful of independence-minded conservatives wield outsized influence simply by being unpredictable, and where the Speaker's authority erodes with each concession he is forced to make.